The rain falling on the banks of the Savio River on the night of October 21, 1944, was not merely weather, it was a tactical condition that reshaped the battlefield. In the gloom of the Italian campaign, where the terrain had devolved into a nightmare of swollen rivers and clinging mud, the technological advantages of the Allied forces were neutralized by the elements. Air support was grounded, artillery observers were blinded by the deluge, and heavy armour bogged down in the sodden earth, leaving the infantry to face the German war machine alone. It was in this claustrophobic, drowning world that Private Ernest Elvius Smith of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada found himself crouching in a ditch, clutching a weapon that most soldiers regarded with a mixture of loathing and terrified respect. He was 30 feet from a German Panther tank. In the sterile language of military reports, 30 feet is a close-quarters engagement. In the reality of human survival, 30 feet is indistinguishable from suicide. At that distance, the deep, rhythmic thrumming of the Panther's Maybach engine vibrates in the chest of the observer. At that distance, one can hear the hydraulic whine of the turret traverse and the shouted commands of the crew inside the steel hull. Smith held a projector, Infantry, universally known by its acronym PIAT, or more colloquially, by the men who hold its 32 pounds of dead weight across Europe, as the suicide stick. To understand why a Canadian private was engaging a 45-ton armoured vehicle with a spring-loaded tube at a range closer than a cricket pitch, one must understand the desperate evolution of British infantry anti-tank doctrine. The PIAT was an anomaly in the arsenal of modern warfare, a weapon that looked backward to the siege engines of the previous century rather than forward to the rocket age. While the Americans fielded the bazooka with its rocket propulsion and the Germans utilized the Panzerschreck with its recoilless rifle technology, the British relied on a spigot mortar. The concept was invented by Lieutenant Colonel Blacker in the 1930s and refined by Major Millis Jeffress of Churchill's Experimental Weapons Division. It operated on a principle of brutal mechanical simplicity. A massive steel spring, coiled under immense tension within a simple metal tube, drove a heavy steel rod, or spigot, forward when the trigger was pulled. This spigot entered the tail of the bomb, struck a percussion cap, and detonated a propellant charge that launched the projectile while simultaneously recocking the spring for the next shot. It was heavy, it was awkward, and it was undeniably crude. Yet, on that rainy night in Italy, it was the only thing standing between Smith's platoon and annihilation. The weapon in Smith's hands represented a specific solution to a terrifying mathematical problem. The German Panther tank, with its sloping frontal armor and high-velocity 75mm cannon, was an apex predator. Its gun could vaporize an infantryman at 3,000 meters. Its machine guns could suppress a platoon at 500 meters. The PIAT, by contrast, had a maximum effective range against moving armor of perhaps 100 yards, though combat veterans knew that 50 yards was the realistic limit if one wanted to guarantee a hit. This created a disparity of engagement envelopes that was almost impossible to overcome. To kill a Panther with a PIAT, a soldier had to traverse thousands of yards of lethal ground, slipping past artillery barrages, mortar screens, and machine gun fire, to enter a zone of intimacy with the enemy, where the survival time was measured in seconds. Every PIAT team that went forward was gambling that darkness, terrain, or sheer audacity would allow them to close that gap before they were cut to pieces. Most lost that gamble. The casualty rates for PIAT teams in Normandy and Italy were horrific, often far exceeding the average attrition for line infantry, but when the gamble paid off, the results were catastrophic for the German crews. Smith was the embodiment of that gamble. As the Panther hunted for targets in the darkness, sweeping its barrel left and right, Smith prepared to fire. The bomb loaded into the front trough of his weapon was a marvel of destructive physics, contrasting sharply with the primitive launcher. It utilized a shaped charged warhead, a technology that relied on the Monroe effect. Inside the bomb, a cone of copper liner was backed by high explosive. Upon impact, the explosive detonated from the rear, focusing the blast energy forward and collapsing the copper cone into a hyper-excited stream of superplastic metal. This jet, moving at roughly 8,000 meters per second, did not penetrate armor through brute force or kinetic energy like a solid shot. It burned through it as a concentrated stream of plasma, ignoring the hardness of the steel or the angle of impact. It could punch through 100 millimeters of armor plate, enough to gut a Panther from the side or rear, and enough to penetrate the turret front if the angle was flat. But to achieve this, the bomb had to hit, and to hit, Smith had to be close. He rose from his cover, However, at a range of 30 feet, he didn't need to rely on the folding aperture sights, which were optimistic at best in daylight and useless in the pitch black of an Italian autumn night. He pointed the heavy tube by instinct, feeling the balance of the weapon against his shoulder. When he pulled the colossal trigger, there was no screech of a rocket motor, no blinding flash of backblast to illuminate his position. There was only the heavy, dull thump of the propellant charge and the metallic clatter of the spring mechanism. The bomb crossed the 9 meters of separation in a fraction of a heartbeat. It struck the Panther on the lower hull, near the tracks. The shaped charge detonated, sending its molten jets screaming through the German steel. The effect inside the tank was immediate and horrific. Fuel or ammunition stores ignited, and the massive vehicle shuddered as internal explosions tore it apart. In the darkness, the burning Panther became a funeral pyre, illuminating the battlefield and signaling to the remaining German armour that the Canadian infantry was not defenceless. The silence that followed the explosion was short-lived. The German infantry supporting the tanks reacted instantly, and the remaining armour began to manoeuvre. This was the moment where the PIAT's greatest flaw usually proved fatal. Reloading the weapon was a physical ordeal that required strength and leverage. The operator had to place the butt of the weapon against a solid surface or use their own body as a brace, unlocking the shoulder pad and rotating it to step on it, then hauling the weapon body up against the spring pressure until it locked into the cocked position. It required nearly 200 pounds of force. Doing this while standing was difficult. Doing it while lying prone in the mud, with enemy machine gun fire shredding the air inches above one's head, required a level of physical exertion and mental control that is difficult to comprehend. Smith, amidst the chaos, reloaded. He did not flee. He did not seek deeper cover. He cocked the weapon, loaded another bomb, and engaged a second Panther that was attempting to bring its gun to bear. His second shot hit, damaging the tank and forcing it to withdraw. He then turned his attention to the self-propelled guns supporting the attack. Smith's actions at the Savio River earned him the Victoria Cross, the highest award for valour in the British Commonwealth. But his story is also the story of the weapon itself, a device that was hated for its weight and complexity yet loved for its ability to equalize the fight between flesh and steel. The PIAT's peculiar design offered advantages that were often overlooked in the complaints about its ergonomics. Unlike the American bazooka, which emitted a distinct 6-meter tongue of flame and smoke from the rear when fired, the PIAT had no back. This was a tactical game-changer. A bazooka team firing from a concealed position in a hedgerow or a building window instantly revealed their location to every German observer on the battlefield. The backblast kicked up dust, scorched walls, and acted as a giant "Here I am" sign for enemy machine gunners. Furthermore, the backblast meant a bazooka could not be fired from an enclosed room without severely injuring or killing the operator. The PIAT, with its closed-tube spigot system, produced almost no thermal signature and minimal smoke. This stealth capability made the PIA the supreme weapon of the ambush. In the house-to-house fighting that characterized the Italian campaign and the urban battles of northwest Europe, British and Canadian troops could hide in the upper stories of ruined buildings, wait for German armour to pass below, and fire downward into the thin top armour of the tanks. They could fire from deep within the shadows of a room, invisible to the tank crews outside. In the hedgerows of Normandy, PIAT teams could lie in wait until a tank was virtually on top of them, fire, and remain concealed long enough to reload or relocate. This lack of signature terrified German tanker crews. Reports from captured German officers and after-action assessments from the Wehrmacht noted a distinct caution when operating against British infantry. They described phantom anti-tank weapons that struck without a flash, leaving crews unable to return fire effectively. This psychological impact, the fear of the unseen ambush, slowed German advances and forced them to commit more infantry to screen their tanks, consuming time and resources they could ill afford to lose. The sheer proliferation of the weapon also contributed to its effectiveness. Between 1943 and 1945, British industry churned out 115,000 PIAT. They were not reserved for specialized anti-tank squads. They were distributed to every infantry platoon, every commando unit, and every airborne formation. If a British soldier was on the battlefield, a PIAT was likely nearby. This ubiquity meant that German armour could never assume an infantry position was soft. Any cluster of foxholes, any ruined farmhouse, any line of trees could harbour a weapon capable of gutting a tiger or a panther. This saturation was a deliberate strategy. The British understood that they could not match the Germans' tank-for-tank in every sector. The solution was to democratize anti-tank capability, placing the means of destruction in the hands of the common infantryman. Despite the strategic logic, the lived experience of the soldier soldier carrying the PIAT was one of burden. The weapon weighed 32 pounds empty, and the bombs added significantly to the load. It was front-heavy, unbalanced, and prone to snagging on every branch, wire, and doorframe it encountered. The sights were a primitive arrangement of folding metal apertures that were easily bent or damaged. The monopod stand was often discarded as useless weight, but the true horror was the spring. Stories abounded of small-statured soldiers who physically could not cock the weapon, rendering them useless as PIAT gunners. In the heat of combat, with adrenaline pumping, and hands slick with sweat and mud, the act of recocking the spring became a frantic, exhausting struggle. A failure to cock the weapon fully could result in a jam, leaving the soldier defenseless with an angry tank bearing down on them. Yet, in surveys conducted by the Canadian Army after the war, combat officers rated the PIAT as the most outstandingly effective infantry weapon of the conflict, placing it even above the beloved Bren gun. This paradox defines the weapon. It was a misery to carry and a terror to operate, but it worked. It killed the things that tried to kill the infantry. The efficacy of the PIAT was not limited to defensive actions or static warfare. It played a crucial role in some of the most fluid and aggressive actions of the war. During the Battle of Arnhem in September 1944, British paratroopers cut off and surrounded used PIATs to turn the urban environment into a killing zone. Major Robert Henry Kane of the South Staffordshire Regiment used the weapon to such devastating effect that he personally destroyed or disabled 6 German tanks, including Tigers. Even after suffering a ruptured eardrum and shrapnel wounds from a premature detonation, Kane continued to hunt armour, eventually resorting to firing mortar at flat trajectories when his PIAT ammunition ran dry. His Victoria Cross citation, like Smith's, underscores the necessity of close-range courage. At Arnhem Bridge, the PIAT was instrumental in halting the reconnaissance battalion of the 9th SS Panzer Division. As the German column attempted to rush the bridge, paratroopers unleashed a volley of PIAT fire at point-blank range, incinerating the lead vehicles and blocking the bridge with burning wreckage. The resulting carnage convinced the German commanders that a coup de main assault was impossible, forcing them into a protracted siege that bought vital time for the Allies. Interestingly, the PIAT's reputation transcended the lines of allegiance. German forces, pragmatic in their desperation, utilized captured PIATs whenever they could find them. The Wehrmacht, usually dismissive of enemy equipment, recognized the utility of a silent, smokeless anti-tank launcher. Photographs from the Eastern Front showed German infantrymen carrying PIATs, presumably captured in the West or Italy, and redeployed to face the Soviet armored hordes. For a German soldier facing T-34s, the lack of backblast was just as valuable as it was for a Canadian facing Panthers. It allowed them to fight from the ruins of German cities without revealing their positions. The fact that the inventors of the Panzerschreck and the Panzerfaust that defined portable anti-warfare chose to use the British Spring contraption is a testament to its battlefield utility. The science behind the hollow charge warhead also meant that the PIAT remained dangerous even as tank armor thickened, while kinetic penetrators struggled against the increasing thickness of German steel, requiring higher and higher velocities to punch through. The chemical energy of the shaped charge remained constant. As long as the fuse worked and the angle was not too extreme, the jet of superplastic metal would do its work. However, the fuse was a weak point in early models. The initial bombs had a failure rate approaching 25%, a statistic that was terrifying for the men using them. Imagine crawling through the mud, risking everything to get within 30 yards of a tank, firing a perfect shot and hearing only a dull clang as the bomb bounced harmlessly off the armor. By 1944, improved fuses had solved this problem, raising reliability to over 90%, but the fear of a dud round always lingered in the back of a gunner's mind. The legacy of the PIAT is a strange one. Technologically, it was a dead end. By the time the war ended, the recoil as rifle principle, exemplified by the American 105mm and later the Swedish Carl Gustaf, had proven to be the future of infantry anti-tank weapons. These weapons offered better range, better accuracy, and easier handling. The spigot mortar concept was abandoned, relegated to the dusty shelves of military museums. Yet doctrinally, the PIAT changed everything. It proved that the infantry platoon did not have to be helpless against armor. It proved that with the right weapon and enough courage, a foot soldier could dictate terms to a tank. The operational lessons learned from the PIAT, specifically the need for weapons that could be fired from enclosed spaces, influenced the design of anti-tank systems for decades to come. The soft launch capability of modern missiles like the Javelin, which ejects the missile before the main motor ignites to protect the gunner, shares a tactical DNA with the PIAT PIAT's no backblast design. But looking back at October 1944, the technological lineage matters less than the visceral reality of the Savio River. Private Ernest Smith did not know he was wielding a weapon that would be considered a technological dead end. He did not care about the physics of the Monroe effect or the comparative advantages of recoilless rifles. He only knew that there were 3 Panther tanks trying to kill his friends, and he had a heavy spring-loaded tube that might stop them. The citation for his Victoria Cross explicitly mentions the distance of 30 feet. It is a distance that defies the logic of modern warfare. It is a distance where the soldier and the tank are intimate adversaries. In that space, the crude mechanics of the PIAT, a heavy spring, the awkward spigot, the wobble of the bomb ceased to be liabilities and became the tools of a miracle. Smith fired. He reloaded. He fired again. He stood his ground against the weight of the German war machine, with a weapon that his own army called a suicide stick. The narrative of the PIAT is ultimately a narrative of British and Commonwealth improvisation. It was not a perfect weapon. It was not elegant. It was a rugged, ugly, difficult piece of engineering, born of desperation in the dark days of 1940. It was built when Britain had nothing else, and it was carried to victory by men who had no other choice. It required a specific kind of bravery to use a cold, calculated willingness to let the enemy get close, to hold fire until the treads of the tank were shaking the ground you lay on. It was a weapon that demanded the operator suppress every natural instinct to flee, and instead step into the path of the oncoming monster as the war ground to a close. The PIAT continued to serve. It cleared bunkers in the Pacific, blew apart pillboxes in the Siegfried Line, and destroyed strongpoints in the final drive into Germany. It was used by the Israelis in 1948 and by various colonial forces well into the 1950s, but its moment of supreme relevance was in the mid-war period, in the hedgerows of Normandy and the mountains of Italy, where the range was short and the fighting was bitter. There, the PIAT was the great equalizer. It allowed the infantry to look a tanker in the eye and pull the trigger. When the smoke cleared at the Savio River, Ernest Smith was still standing. The Panthers were broken or retreating. The bridgehead was secure. The PIAT had done its job. It is easy to look at the weapon today, with its comical appearance and archaic spring mechanism, and dismiss it as a folly. But the charred hulks of Panthers and Tigers scattered across the battlefields of Europe tell a different story. They tell the story of a weapon that, for all its flaws, delivered death when it mattered most. It was the infantryman's answer to the arrogance of armour. It was the heavy, hateful, beautiful suicide stick that won the war, one 30-foot shot at a time. The men who carried it cursed it every mile of the march, but when the engine noise of a panzer grew loud in the darkness, there was nothing else they would rather have in their hands. The PIAT was, in the end, a triumph of function over form, a testament to the idea that if a weapon is stupid but it works, it isn't stupid. And at 30 feet, in the rain, against a Panther, the PIAT worked